Week 2, Part 1, 2.1, Creating Context. Now that you have finalized and submitted your P1 plan, we are ready to dive into the process of creating our group presentation by learning about the role context plays in constructing arguments and practicing with a sample for homework, which will prepare us to find our own articles and apply the same approach and techniques in 2.2. Taken together, the content and assignments in 2.1 and 2.2 will allow you and your team to develop an understanding of the topic and locate contextual information to provide key points for the background that will serve as the foundation of your group presentation and your position papers. Exposition, argumentation, and persuasion. Informative or expository writing aims to inform readers and explain information without the goal of persuading readers to support a stated position. But expository writing is also included in argumentative texts. Argumentative writing requires context, such as background information or the definition of related terms, to frame the larger topic, ground the evidence, and situate the claims intended to persuade the readers. An expository text can provide information aimed at informing readers without stating a position or providing claims and evidence intended to support a position or to persuade the reader. But an argumentative text can include much of the same information as part of the effort to persuade an audience. As a result, expository writing and argumentative writing often are intertangled. To further complicate this distinction between expository and argumentative writing, while expository articles do not state or support a position explicitly, the information can impact the opinion of a reader, sometimes unintentionally, and sometimes intentionally. For instance, if a drug company wants to inform consumers about a product, they may publish a guide that provides information about the product, without a stand or the expressed intention of persuading the reader to use the drug, or at least to think it is safe. But the information included and excluded would be framed by the drug company's overarching mission to make money and sell their product. Even the language used to frame the same information would be determined to be part of a larger goal to sell the product. Whereas if a nonprofit organization of researchers with the mission of informing consumers released an informative pamphlet on the same drug, the mission included in the language used to frame the information would reflect not only the immediate goal of informing the consumer, but also the broad mission of the organization. Zooming out and adding context about the organization and intention of the text expands the understanding of the informative writing and suggests that while the piece is expository and only informs the reader, the information cannot be divorced from the larger intention. The context, however, does not make the informative pamphlet argumentative and does not discredit the information, which needs to be evaluated individually to determine its strength. But it does allow us to situate the information within the broad context of persuasion. Persuasive writing and argumentative writing can be seen as interchangeable, or they can be considered distinct. The goal of argumentative writing can be framed as wanting your audience to acknowledge an argument, and the goal of persuasive writing can be framed as wanting to convince your audience to agree with the stated position instead of simply acknowledging the evidence and claims. For our purposes, we recognize the overlap and accept the distinction. Our focus is on constructing a strong argument in support of our position, which we want our audience to acknowledge. And while we do admit that we can't test the efficacy of our attempt to persuade our audience, we do want that consideration to be acknowledged as part of the goal. While we want to consider the context and intention of information we encounter, our current goal is to isolate information and practice deconstructing and constructing arguments by stating and supporting a position with claims and evidence. As part of that process, information in the form of context should provide our foundation as readers and researchers and provide the foundation of the case we make to support our position. How a piece of information was used in the original source does not determine how it will be used in our presentation or paper. A piece of information that was used as evidence in a persuasive piece, which may or may not have been a persuasive piece directly related to the argument we will engage in our presentation, may be used as part of the context intended to inform our audience. A piece of information used only to inform readers in a source may be used as a piece of evidence in our presentation. Each piece of information we encounter and collect can be framed and interpreted in any number of ways to inform or persuade readers. Initially, we will read to gather information both to inform us and potentially to serve as information that will be included in our presentations and papers to provide readers with context to ground the claims and evidence that support our position. Our presentation calls for a section of context before the introduction of claims and evidence, so our current goal is to collect general information on our topic that can be used as context. On context. Context is the general information needed to understand a situation, which includes the historical background that led to the current situation and all the pieces that make up the current state of affairs. Some movies provide background information in an exposition that situates the characters within a setting or offers a series of flashbacks that provide the backstory. Current context is often presented through cross-cutting or parallel editing that shows us what is happening simultaneously in other locations. You may have learned to ask questions like who, what, when, where, how, and why to contextualize a situation. In nonfiction, context includes all the information needed to understand the larger conversation, which can include definitions and explanations of terms, the history of what created the situation, information about who recorded the information, and any other pieces of general but relevant information. Context also includes the different perspectives that observers, stakeholders, and participants bring to the conversation. Think of this as the past and present upon which a future and a path forward will be projected. You can think about the different perspectives as their own categories, which bring different sources of information to your position. Some categories include historical, social, economic, institutional, and ideological. Think about what kind of information a source is presenting. If it is a historical fact, you are probably presenting historical context. If the information is about annual finances, it is probably a financial context. Sometimes the information you present can fit more than one context, like in-state versus out-of-state tuition for USF, which includes facts about finances as well as specific information related to the institution of USF. General information on a topic can be used as context to inform the reader or as evidence to support a claim. Information in any form or format, quote, statistic, date, data, may be included in the background paragraph after the introduction and before the claims in order to inform the readers about the overall topic and prepare them to understand the claims and evidence, or the same quote, statistic, or date could be used as evidence to support a claim. Information is just information until you integrate it as part of a larger project that uses the information in a specific way. This is an image that is an example research flowchart that uses brackets similar to the ones in your previous reading. And you can see how it goes from more general information into the background context that we're talking about, which could also be refined into evidence, which gets refined into your claims, and finally, it makes up your position. When we first start reading about a topic, we don't know what will be used as evidence yet, so we start by reading all the information and collecting it as general information. General information not only informs us, but it also has the potential to be used in our presentation or paper. Some of that information may be used as context to inform our audience and provide important information needed to understand the rest of the paper or presentation. And some may be used as evidence to support a claim. Much of the information won't even make it to the bracket. As we see above, general information can range from statistics to opinions, all of which can be located across a variety of sources and texts that range from expository or argumentative to governmental data or data sets you generated as part of your research. This image is a bunch of brackets under general information, which shows how it gets refined and some of it gets dropped out as not useful for your position paper or your presentation. While all of this information falls under the umbrella of general information, until we start to construct claims and align evidence into clusters and categories that support claims, We cannot know which general information is important context for our audience to know in order to understand our claims and evidence. When a position isn't predetermined, as it is in our case, the flow of our brackets is less circular because we do not know the answers until we look at the evidence and cluster it into claims to see what position actually has the most and best support. Because our position is assigned, we already know what we are looking for, which helps limit our search. When we write an argumentative piece, we need to inform the reader by providing relevant context and related information as the foundation of our presentation or paper. Scholarly articles often include a literature review that situates the research and results within a broad conversation by providing an overview of the relevant scholarly literature. This literature review provides the scholarly context that supports the broad context and starts to dive into the topic. When you participate in an argument as part of an assignment for school or work, or to convince anyone of anything, your audience will benefit from understanding the topic before you present your position and the claims and evidence you offer in support of your position. The other important role of context within research is for you to inform yourself as a researcher. Sometimes we present evidence as a subject matter expert, and sometimes we engage in a topic we know nothing about. But most of the time, we know something about the topic, but not nearly enough to state and support a position. In theory, the real goal of research is not to start from an existing opinion and find evidence to support our stand, but to learn about a topic so that we can develop an educated and informed opinion before we work to convince others. In practice, much of the argumentative writing we will do will have little or nothing to do with our opinion and will derive instead from an assignment that requires us to present support for a conclusion or action based on the strongest evidence we can find. And while it would make sense that we would be impacted by the evidence we find, making a strong argument is not inherently connected to our own belief. We can all find a place of ambivalence, meaning a conflict we have not reconciled, within our own beliefs. And if we look closely, we can even find a place where we have very strong information that contradicts a belief we maintain, perhaps even an action we continue. Sometimes we refuse to adjust our beliefs or actions in accordance with the strong evidence presented. Sometimes we simply refuse to listen to the strong evidence. And sometimes we make up grand stories and excuses to justify our inability to reconcile the disconnect. But that work is for a different course or another day. Our goal is to learn about the practice of argumentative writing. And our goal in this reading is to start with context. Just as expository writing is part of most other genres and assignments, learning about the context of a situation is part of most of the research we do, be it formal or informal and personal or academic or professional. One of the initial steps in the research process is simply to learn more about a topic. And while sources that are informative like Wikipedia are useful in this process, we can also look to texts that present different arguments related to a topic or that support a specific position with evidence built upon strong context, and look at the information within these argumentative pieces as a way to learn more about the background while we are locating evidence to support our position. The goal is to gather information about the topic. The information will be used in different ways as you and your team members learn more about the topic of state funding for USF and start to develop claims in support of a position and identify evidence to support these claims. As we saw above, the same piece of information can be used as context to inform your reader or as evidence to support a claim. In fact, many pieces of information can be used as evidence to support conflicting claims, which is why the reasoning to connect the claims is vital. Think of context that informs your audience and evidence that supports a claim as potential categories for all the information you gather. And think of your individual and collective thinking as the way you will create connections that allow general information to be used as context or evidence. This image shows a Venn diagram, which talks about general information, potential context, potential overlap, evidence, and where the potential context and potential evidence overlap. Within the potential evidence and potential context, you see more circles, which just give you general information that it's evidence for a claim, or relevant background and context. Just as we will move through the process of advancing from context to claims, Your audience will need to be provided with the important and relevant contextual information needed to understand the argument. Some of that information may be used as evidence or in the explanation of your evidence, but the foundational information that helps inform the larger conversation will be offered early in your presentation as background context. Context in context. For our group presentation, each group will answer the question, should the state of Florida decrease funding for the University of South Florida? The answer is the position you will support with evidence, which is a good example of a realistic assignment within and beyond your undergraduate coursework, because instead of asking you to become a subject matter expert or develop your own informed opinion, the assignment asks you to answer a question on a topic and support that position with evidence. Personal opinions or anecdotal experiences aren't expected or explicitly excluded. The assignment description in the P1 overview and the outline for the group presentation call for a statement of the position, context, claims, and evidence, opposition and refutation, and a conclusion. Context will provide general information on the state of Florida and the funding of USF. Evidence will support claims that support a position, an answer to the question. And including evidence in support of positions opposed to your position will allow your group to situate your position within the larger argument and refute the main opposition. Starting with the basic search for context will help us understand the topic and will lead us to adjacent elements on the topic that will help expand our understanding of the topic. The immediate goal for you and your peers is to understand the topic, but the best points of the information you record will be used in the presentations and papers to lay the groundwork for your position by providing the necessary information that allows your reader to understand the big picture of the situation. The contextual information provided should be tailored to the audience and the position. If your reader knows very little about the topic, you should provide basic information. If you are an expert writing for other experts, you still want to ground your position, but you will know that you don't need to define basic terms. For instance, in both cases, you will want to include information that helps you and your reader understand the topic better. You will not include all the background information and context you read in your final product. So to start, simply gather information that is relevant to the question. Once you begin constructing the support for your position, you will be able to select the relevant context to include. For instance, if you support a claim by presenting evidence that the economic impact of USF is vital to the sustained growth of the state of Florida, your context will likely include background information on the state budget and the historical data on funding for USF. And if you connect that evidence to other evidence in support of the claim that decreasing funding for USF will have a negative impact on the economy, you will need to contextualize the evidence in the claim so that it is connected to your position, which in this case sounds like it would be against decreasing funding for USF. This image shows two columns of the bracket, one general information. You decide what is relevant out of that general information you collect. It could be dates, opinions, facts, budgets, any of those kind of things. And what is relevant gets whittled down into what you use as background context. Not all of it will be used. You will also see that it moves from the background context and it talks about reasoning and connections. We'll get on to that later. Best points of context to include in your presentation won't necessarily be clear until you know what evidence and claims you are using to support your position. But reading for context at the beginning of your research will help you identify the strong and relevant information so that you can dive into those sources during the research process. Keeping track of your work throughout the research process will make identifying and connecting the strongest points of context and evidence easy and effective when it is time to prepare the presentation and your paper. Reading for context. When you are beginning a research project and reading to understand the topic and in search of general information to use in the presentation or paper, you will employ and apply many of the same techniques used in all of your academic reading and any other reading where the goal is to understand the content and identify key elements. Begin by identifying what you are reading for and making sure you have a plan to note those elements in and on the text, and then to store key points in a place where you can find them and in a format that you can use. Structured approaches are useful in general, but when you are working as a group, it is important to develop shared approaches before you dive into the individual work. Shared approaches save time and spare everyone from having to bring order to all the individual approaches or of each team member to produce a clear, coherent, and concise presentation. For instance, if you are planning to use MLA format, make sure all members know how to use it and use it correctly from the start to avoid extensive editing or an unclear product. You'll also want to keep your audiences for the presentation and paper and your instructor's preferences in mind. The P1 plan you submitted should have clarified elements of the presentation packet, such as the grid and the annotated bibliography. But because you will be gathering contextual material for your presentation at this point, you will want to clarify not only what you need to know and how it needs to be formatted, but also what you will need to find your way back to the sources when you are constructing the presentation in paper. Reading for and recording some standard elements is always a good place to start. Realistically, the first thing you do to most articles, even the ones you want to read carefully, is skim them to see if they have the kind of information you need, which is a fine place to start. For now, we will be working with an assigned source, so we don't have to decide whether or not the article is a fit. But skimming can still be helpful because it will give you an idea of what to look for as you read closely. Once you are ready to read a source carefully, knowing what information you want to note and record before you read is also a vital part of researching and reading for comprehension. As you read, note important information that will help you, your peers, and your audience understand the broad topic. Also note any information that is used to support claims or a position, if a position is stated. After we gather information to use as context, we will start to look at arguments. So if you encounter a persuasive piece while you are reading for context, it cannot hurt to start paying attention to the structure of the arguments you engage. After you identify a few important pieces of general information, you can record relevant information in a place where you can retrieve it and connect it to the information your team members are contributing. Your group grid should include any criteria in columns for each of the main takeaways you want to share, and your shared bib will develop specific approaches as you collect sources. The grid can include multiple tabs on the bottom to distinguish categories such as general information, relevant context, and evidence, and the bibliography can be delineated with headings as well. When you are reading a text in search of specific pieces of information, you can lose the big picture goal, which is to comprehend the complete text so that you can start to understand the overarching topic. Perhaps the most important takeaway of all the text you and your peers engage in is simply to write a one-sentence summary. For instance, note whether the text contains a clear thesis, so you can use it in constructing your summary. While you need a concise summary of the text to make it useful for you and your group, how to format it and what to include can vary based on your instructor's direction or your group's goals. Pulling the thesis or pasting the main ideas may be enough for your group, or you may decide that you want a 3-sentence summary with a signal phrase and a direct quote, which would prepare you for stronger work and more comprehensive products. Shared structure and sample. Our goal for individual members of each team to locate, annotate, and share resources throughout each step of the process. To do so successfully not only requires the P1 plan, it requires getting on the same page in practice, not just on paper. Before each team works independently and each team member works individually, we will practice collectively. Starting with a shared source will allow us to practice together in preparation for locating individual articles and compiling information across the group. Reviewing this work together will allow everyone to ask questions and let each group clarify processes, procedures, and preferences in practice. We will all read the following text: USF among top Florida institutions in key performance areas. Before you read, review the assignment requirements so that you know what you will be doing with what you are reading. Number 1, format the source reference for the article with a link to the text. Number 2, quote or paraphrase 2 sentences of relevant information with formatting. Number 3, write a 1-sentence summary of the article. In addition to using this format for our sample article in 2.1, we will identify and gather the same points of information from the articles we locate and read in 2.2. Sharing structured approaches and formats throughout our research and writing process is important. The formatted reference will give everyone in the group access to the text and prepare the source to be dropped into a presentation or paper. Even though we all have access to the sample article, take this opportunity to practice formatting and linking according to the expectations of your group, which will allow everyone on the team to clarify expectations and make sure everyone understands the formatting structure. As we move forward, formatting the content as you read and taking notes instead of gathering a bunch of unformatted information not only allows us to practice the related skills so that we are prepared for our presentation and paper, it also saves us time in the end and guards the whole team against plagiarism. When you are pulling content directly from sources and pasting it into a new space for use later, it can be easy to get confused and not know which pieces are quotes and which pieces are your thoughts or commentary. Even when you know it is a quote because you included the quotation marks, if you didn't include the in-text citation, you will have to scour all the text you read to find the source and the quoted context. When working with a group, formatting the research notes is even more important. Because the source of the content is an important element in determining which pieces of evidence to include in the group presentation, without the source information included in the grid and bib and any other shared spaces, team members will not be able to review the possible content and select the strongest pieces to include in the presentation. In our case, not only will the content be shared in the presentation, you will then draw from the same research notes to construct your position papers. So following best practices in attribution during organization is important. While the formatting will be tailored to fit the style you and your group selected, you should always use the signal phrase to introduce quoted or paraphrased source material, and you need to add an in-text citation with author and page or paragraph indicating the source of the information. The specifics of the signal phrase may vary when you use the source material as context, which is less likely to require the article title than when you include source material as evidence to support a position. Different formats and fields have varied expectations and preferences related to the use of direct quotes or paraphrasing, and your instructor will likely have preference. So be sure to clarify this as you create your context test sentences. All formats and instructors, however, require the inclusion of in-text citations and attribution. The two formatted sentences should include relevant information to use as potential context in the presentation or the paper. To identify and extract this information, you must read the article closely and critically. Look for information that helps you understand the topic, including dates and statistics and other concrete elements or turning points is valuable. After reading closely and extracting these points, write a one-sentence summary of USF among top Florida institutions and key performance areas, which is useful not only for your understanding and possible later use in the position paper, but it is also ultimately tailored for potential use by your team members and possibly for the presentation or your paper. In addition to submitting your work for this assignment, all this work will be submitted in the presentation pack for your group presentation. So be sure to include it in shared bibliography and group grid as you submit it with each assignment. Also, keep track of your own work in your own notes because you may want to submit your content in the personal packet for your position paper. Again, you want to avoid accidentally using sentences that one of your group members wrote, which may show up in both of your position papers and send up a red flag for plagiarism. By submitting the same assignment on the same source to a discussion post in 2.1, everyone will be able to see the different approaches. When you read your peers' post, recognize what is done well, but also simply recognize the differences. There are many valid and unique styles that come through in our writing. Those differences are very valuable and demonstrate our voice in our writing. As long as the content is included, it is great to see that there is not only one right way to do this work. These multiple approaches help you recognize strong work and think about what elements make it strong. Your instructor and your group can modify and extend this template to include any other elements that are important to create a concise context that provides all the necessary foundational information your audience needs to understand the evidence you will offer in support of your answer to the question. Assignment 2.1. Read USF among top Florida institutions and key performance areas and complete the following. Number 1, format the source reference for the article with a link to the text. Number 2, quote or paraphrase 2 sentences of relevant information with formatting. Number 3, write a one-sentence summary of the article.